Um, I'm going to take one step back to just since we didn't have, there was a Federation program on race and religion, part two, last Monday night. And so our last session was 2 weeks ago. So we had stopped at Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, only president to serve two non-consecutive terms as president, separated by Benjamin Harrison. So 1884 to 1888, and then 1892 to 1896. It is said that when they left the White House, Cleveland's wife said to one of the staff members, "Don't touch anything because we'll be back in 4 years." And lo and behold, they were. Cleveland was born in New Jersey. His dad was a Presbyterian minister, but he made his political name known in Buffalo. He moved to Buffalo, became the mayor, eventually became governor of New York. There were certain governorships in the late 19th century that were really springboards to the highest office in the land. New York was one. Ohio was another. A lot of presidents came out of Ohio in the late 19th century. Cleveland was known for his personal integrity. It came out just about 10 days before the election that, 10 days before his nomination as the candidate for the Democrats, that he had fathered a son with a woman he did not marry. Now, he was not married, and she wasn't, but it was wedlock, and that was very scandalous in late 19th century Victorian America. Instead of denying the reports, or they didn't have public relations firms, but he didn't try to spin things in such a way. He actually, drumroll, admitted the truth, and he went on to win the election. It was a close one, but he went on to win. During his first term in office, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire refused to accept the credentials of the appointed American ambassador, John Keeley. Why? Because Keeley's wife was Jewish, even though Keeley himself was not. Cleveland condemned the intolerance, and he actually, rather than appoint somebody else, he said to the Austrian-Hungarian government, "This is who we've appointed. If you don't want to accept him as our ambassador, then there will be no ambassador." And so the post was left vacant. As I also mentioned, I think 2 weeks ago, Cleveland had staunch support from the Strauss brothers, not Robert and Ricard, the composers, but Oscar, Isidore, and Nathan. They were partners in, later sole owners of R.H. Macy department store. Oscar was graduated from Columbia University Law School. He really spent all of his career in public service. Cleveland appoints him as U.S. Minister to Turkey. As we'll see, Turkey became known as the Jewish ambassadorial post. There should be no reason why you would. I mean, maybe they figured, they all like hummus and pita. I'm sure Cleveland didn't know what hummus or pita was, but Jews seem to be the ones who were always appointed as ambassador to Turkey, because that's where Oscar Strauss was sent as ambassador. He was particularly close to Isidore Strauss, and actually the last person that Cleveland would see before his own death in 1908. The day before was Isidore Strauss. So even after Cleveland's presidency, he remained close. And Isidore Strauss ends up perishing with his wife on the Titanic. And I think we mentioned that Oscar Strauss would send a case of matzah to Cleveland every year around Pesach time. Cleveland like matzah. So such was Grover Cleveland, but sandwiched in between him was Benjamin Harrison. Didn't have a reputation for much of a presidency. He did come from an illustrious political family. He had an ancestor who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and his grandfather was William Henry Harrison, who was the 9th president, right? Tyler and Tippecanoe too. He was old Tip. He had the longest inaugural address, and it was an hour and 40 minutes. He was not wearing a coat. He caught cold, got pneumonia. He died 31 days after office. Not Benjamin Harrison, his grandfather, William. Harrison was a deeply religious and devout Presbyterian who was very sympathetic to the idea of Zionism. Harrison expressed, now this is, keep in mind, right, this is almost 20 years, a little less, but almost 20 years before Theodor Herzl. Right? Political Zionism does not exist. You have groups of Jews, the Chovevei Tzion, who are leaving Tsarist Russia. Chovevei Tzion means lovers of Zion. And they are the ones who are the founders of some of the first modern settlements in Palestine, in what belonged to the Ottoman Turks. Rishon LeZion, right, is a great example. Zichron Yaakov. These were all people looking to flee oppression in Tsarist Russia. So Harrison expresses public concern over the worsening predicament of Jews in Russia. In 1891, a delegation of Jewish leaders, including Simon Wolf, we've mentioned him a bunch of times, Oscar Strauss, Jacob Schiff, right? Some of these folks are in that book, Our Crowd, which details the German Jewish barons, banking magnates, other tycoons. Jacob Schiff is another one, also an early benefactor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The gates to the campus on 122nd Street are still there with his name upon them. Lewis Marshall, another. These were all, high reform Jews. They were, but they were involved with a variety of Jewish causes, and also were pillars of Temple Emmanuel in New York and Reform Judaism. Jesse Seligman of the Seligman banking family. They all met with Harrison and persuaded the president to appoint a special commissioner to go check out conditions in Russia. So Harrison does this. He appoints the commissioner of immigration at Ellis Island, a fellow named John Weber. And Weber goes and travels in Tsarist Russia, comes back with a damning report. Nothing of any fundamental substance was undertaken, but Harrison does express public sympathy and solidarity with the Jews of Russia. You can argue that really, that and a Metro card gets you on the subway. On the other hand, these were statements that carried a certain amount of weight, that the world was in fact paying attention. In 1891, this is a rather fascinating sort of aside to American history and Jewish history. But I'm actually, if I ever decide, if I ever have the chance to take my sabbatical and start working a book, this guy whom I'm about to tell you, he really fascinates me. Okay, so who is he? President Harrison receives a petition from prominent non-Jewish Americans right, urging him to call an international conference to consider, quote, the condition of the Israelites and their claims to Palestine as their ancient home, and to promote in all other just and proper ways the alleviation of their suffering condition. Now, this is 6 years before the first Zionist Congress, and 4.5, 5 years before, Herzl has his epiphany. And these are not Jews. This effort was initiated by a Presbyterian clergyman named Reverend William Blackstone, William E. Blackstone. No relationship to the famous English jurist. I mean, as far as I know, but Reverend William E. Blackstone, his program of Jewish restoration to Palestine is called the Blackstone Memorial. Now, he got 413 prominent Christians to sign this petition, this document. People like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Congressman William McKinley, soon to be President McKinley, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Melville Fuller, Thomas Reed, who was the Speaker of the House. This is, he believed in a restoration of Jews as a necessary condition of the second coming. But Blackstone actually evolves after this into really simply being concerned of finding a place for Jews to go, that they would have haven. He takes great exception to the Zionists who came to be known as the territorialists. Some of you might know that colonial Britain was at one point, we don't know exactly how serious, but had proposed the idea of establishing a Jewish territory as a safe haven in Uganda, 1903. And there were some Zionists who said, hey, it's not Palestine, but what does it matter? We haven't, really had a homeland there for 2,000 years. And others said, no, we have no claim to Uganda. We have no connection to Uganda. Blackstone was very much opposed to the idea of the territorialist plan to settle in Uganda. He felt that this was an affront. Jews had a claim to only one spot on the face of the earth, and that was in Palestine, not in Uganda. So Herzl kind of sat on the fence with this, but he fought, from his outside perspective, but he fought against the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Uganda. He dies, I believe, in the 30s, Blackstone. He calls himself God's little errand boy. But anyway, just in researching the presidents, I came across this guy, and I am now, totally fascinated by him. So you have Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, and then in 1896, you get McKinley. Right, McKinley is elected for 2 terms by one of the largest landslides in American history. He campaigns by doing nothing. His famous campaign was to sit on his front porch campaign. People came and they held rallies in his front yard. Boy, things have changed. But he is also the last Civil War veteran elected to the presidency. He had been an officer during the Civil War, and that's important to know because it also helps understand why he was so reluctant for so long to go to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War. He had horrific memories of Civil War battlefields. And, in the end, the Spanish-American War was described, I'm not sure it was by Roosevelt, maybe it was Roosevelt who said, this splendid little war. Um, it was only 4 months, just a couple hundred, just a couple of hundred American deaths. America got a lot out of it in terms of now being an imperialist power. But McKinley had, no way of knowing that, and he was very much opposed to the idea of America going to war, having seen firsthand how gory and horrible the battlefield could be. During his first term, though, despite his reluctance, yes, America embarks on the Spanish-American War. Guam becomes an American possession, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. America, in helping Cuba gain its independence, gets special rights in Cuba, one of which exists to this very day. It's called Guantanamo, Guantanamo Bay. And it's also during his presidency that Hawaii is annexed. The result of sugar barons on the island overthrowing Queen Liliuokalani. Say that 10 times fast. And the legitimate government. So Hawaii gets to be a territory and ultimately a state because we engineer a coup and get rid of the rightful government of the country. Jews generally supported the war against Spain, right? We have long memories. And, we were thinking Inquisition, the expulsion from Spain. Granted, it was 400 plus years later, but Jews generally had very little positive feeling for Spain. Several served with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, including one fellow named Jacob Wilbuski. Jacob Wilbuski. He was a Jewish cowboy from Texas. He was only 16 years old when he volunteered for the Rough Riders. He'd also have the unfortunate distinction of being the first soldier in Roosevelt's outfit to fall in battle as the Rough Riders stormed San Juan Hill, not on horse, but dismounted. One newspaper, the American Israelite, characterized Spain as a barbaric and decadent country, observing that, quote, a state's mistreatment of its Jewish population has throughout history served as a moral barometer. That's not the only place where that sentiment has been expressed. And very often it actually does serve as a pretty good rule of thumb about, if Jews are persecuted in a particular country, it tends to be a nasty place where others are also oppressed and persecuted. McKinley is invited to attend the laying of a new building of the Washington Hebrew Congregation in September 1897. He comes and brings the entire cabinet with him. Let's see if I can, let's see this picture. Here we are. Right. Let me go back into Zoom. All right. See if we can just get this on the screen. All right. Everybody see that? Hopefully. There he is. Cabinet is over here behind him. And he is on the dais addressing the Washington Hebrew Congregation, which was and is the oldest synagogue in Washington, D.C. McKinley also, right, Oscar Strauss, there he is again. What position does Oscar Strauss have? Well, yes, he is the the minister to Turkey during the Cleveland administration. Strauss goes back to Turkey in 1898 at McKinley's behest. So very interesting that Strauss had been a Democrat, a friend of Grover Cleveland, but he also had a good relationship with McKinley. He was an advocate of sound money and the gold standard. That was one of the big differences between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans were very much fiscally conservative with the gold standard, and the Democratic Party, many of them, not all, they were definitely gold Democrats. Cleveland was, fairly fiscally conservative, but many of the Democrats, including the candidate that McKinley ran against, William Bryan Jennings, rather, was believed in free silver. And I don't want to get lost in the weeds with the difference between free silver and 16-to-1 coinage, and that will take us far afield. But anyway, so Strauss goes back to that Jewish ambassadorial post in Istanbul, or Constantinople, if you prefer, as a U.S. ambassador to Turkey. So he's assassinated, of course, McKinley in 1901 by Leon Czolgosz, who's a self-proclaimed anarchist, on September 5th, 1901. McKinley was a very friendly guy. He liked to press the flesh, and he was shaking hands. And Czolgosz had a hand wrapped with looked like a bandage. And as he went to shake McKinley's hand, he was literally no more than 3 feet away. He pulled out a pistol from the wrapped hand and shot him before he could be subdued. But he was subdued, and ultimately he was electrocuted. He was sent to the chair. So I'm going to stop here before we move on to Teddy Roosevelt, right? Because I thought this would be a perfect time to talk a little bit about Hanukkah and White House traditions. But let me just stop here for a moment. Questions, comments before we get to Bull Moose and Teddy Roosevelt. Any questions about Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley?
Rabbi, in the beginning of your speech about Cleveland, the ambassador to Austria-Hungary, and
Yes.
You said that his wife was Jewish and they protested, and then
they wouldn't accept his credentials because they didn't want to have an ambassadorial wife who was a Jew. They would be inviting ambassadors to all of these, aristocratic functions.
Right. But you said that they had no ambassador then? They were that anti-Semitic because the guy's wife was Jewish and rather have no ambassador?
No. In other words, Cleveland said, this is the guy I picked. If you don't want him, I'm not sending an ambassador. So, I mean, there was an embassy and there were other lower, there are cases where an ambassador is not appointed. So you have lower functionaries that handle, normal embassy business.
Rabbi, having worked in an embassy myself, I'm aware that when they do not have an ambassador, the next person in charge is called the charge d'affaires ad interim. In other words, the person in charge in between.
So, thank you, Carol. Well, I mean, so the upshot is Cleveland could have appointed somebody, could have easily found another ambassador with a Gentile wife. He just refused to do so.
And the Austria also refused to accept the guy. Wow.
Well, they didn't want to accept his credentials. They were reluctant. They said, send us somebody else. And Cleveland said no.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Unbelievable.
okay, Dr. Cantor, did you have a question?
Yeah, you're going to talk about Hanukkah, so it's a good segue to my question.
Well, I'm going to talk about Hanukkah in the White House. I'm not going to talk about the
Well,
holiday of Hanukkah.
it's just a quick question based upon your Devar on Shabbat. You mentioned that the only place that is mention of Hanukkah is in Maccabees 1 and 2. And,
Well, in the Talmud, it doesn't talk about the Maccabean Wars. Yes.
but the Maccabees 1 and 2 are part of the Apocrypha. It didn't make it into the.
That's correct. But
Yeah.
historically, they are contemporaneous, more or less, to the Maccabees themselves. So they are historical documents. They're just not religious ones for us.
Yeah, it's not. But
All right. So
it did make it into.
yeah, I want to keep going because that's not related to the topic. But I'm happy if you want to send. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, though.
Rabbi, can I just ask?
Anyway, go ahead. There was yes, Georgia.
Sure, I just wanted to ask, with Blackstone and Harrison, none of the other countries like England or anyone else would support, the thought of a Palestine state?
Not at that point. I mean, Blackstone was, before his time.
Okay, and Harrison also could not convince anyone else, any other leaders to support it.
Harrison was sympathetic, but this was not a policy goal of his.
Okay.
What I find, so it really had no political afterlife. Fact, though, that he was able to garner the signatures of 400 very prominent American civic leaders, business leaders, is quite interesting. And I haven't, like I said, that's, if I were to sit down and write a biography, that's the one that I would, there are a couple of things and interests that I have, but he's definitely one of the most recent that go on my list. So I want to talk a little bit about White House Hanukkah traditions, because here we are in the middle of Hanukkah. Obviously, right, for the most part, the only holiday that made it into the White House was Christmas, right? John Adams and Abigail, right? They're also the first residents of the White House. Not 100% finished, but they're the first president, first lady to live in the mansion. It wasn't called the White House; it was called the Executive Mansion in those days. So they threw a very modest Christmas party with, it was planned with their 4-year-old granddaughter, and invitations were sent out to select government officials and their children. Obviously, no Hanukkah. So fast forward now, 1923, Calvin Coolidge is the one who inaugurates the practice of lighting an official White House Christmas tree. If you've wondered, when the idea of lighting the White House Christmas tree came around, it was Calvin Coolidge. He's also the president who delivers the first formal presidential Christmas message, right? He assumes, like not everybody, but most other Americans of the time did, that, hey, everybody celebrates Christmas, right? So neither Adams nor anybody before Coolidge, or even, shortly thereafter, mentioned anything to Hanukkah. So who is the first president? It'll be a trivia question. First president who pays attention to Hanukkah. Anybody want to guess? You have the satisfaction of knowing you're right. I can't. There's no. I don't have a.
Jimmy Carter was the first president to light a Hanukkah, but your question wasn't who the first to light; it was who paid attention.
No. I mean, I don't know what, people might have said, oh, yes, it's Hanukkah. No, but you're absolutely right. In an official capacity, it is Jimmy Carter. Very good. In 1979, and was right after, and I remember this, in part because, I mean, the president had never done this, but it was right after, during the weeks of seclusion. He spent a couple of weeks where he really didn't go out very much. It was after the Iranians took the staff of the U.S. embassy, right? The Iranian students who held 52 diplomats and citizens hostage, the U.S. embassy in Tehran. Carter emerges, despite this seclusion, in '79, and he walks across the street to Lafayette Park, and there he lights a large Chanukiah, right, which came to be dubbed the quote unquote national menorah. It was erected in the park with private funds, and he delivered brief remarks. The first Hanukkah lighting in the White House itself, though, was George H. Bush. Right? He displayed a menorah there. The Synagogue Council of America gave him a Chanukiah, an Orthodox group, and he displayed the Chanukiah in the White House. Carter went across the street. George H. Bush did it in the White House. But the first president to actually light a menorah in the White House was this president. I'm going to see if I can share this. Let's see. Okay. Do that. Just going to share a minute or two of this. We'll optimize that. All right, hopefully you can hear. Yeah, let's see. I'm just gonna, you recognize who that is, of course.
Yeah.
It is Bill Clinton.
Every day. Oh, I saw you on TV.
You did? That's good.
Me too.
What's on the top?
TV every day. That's stupid.
Okay, come on, kids, we gotta light it now.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik neh el Hanukkah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim lavoteinu, bayamim hahem hazman hazeh. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'eheyanu v'hiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Happy Hanukkah.
He needs Monica to wait. Be part of that.
All right, that's
Okay, you still okay? Not scared?
that's the hold on. That is the famous moment.
What happened at the end?
Well, so this hold on. This little girl's hair catches on fire.
Oh my God. Oh,
One of her ponytails. So it's there. It's a part of a small little note in White House history. The first president to actually light a Chanukiah in the Oval Office. A little girl catches her ponytail on fire. Clinton, rubs the ponytail, asks her if she's scared, and life goes on. In 98, Clinton joins Israeli President Ezer Weizmann in lighting a Chanukiah on the first night of Hanukkah in Jerusalem. So that was another first. But there were no White House parties under Clinton. Instead, there would just be generic holiday parties. The first annual Hanukkah party, George W. Bush. All right, so George H. Bush is the first to have a Chanukiah displayed in the White House, and his son begins with having Hanukkah parties. And he went out of his way to explain that the White House belongs to people of all faith, and just as there were as an annual Christmas message, an annual Christmas tree lighting, he felt that this was an important statement. Hasidic leaders began attending these parties. And in 2005, the White House Hanukkah party was made glatt kosher and has stayed that way ever since. Obama maintained the tradition of the White House Hanukkah party. He held two of them, actually, two different nights of Hanukkah in 2013. And of course, Donald Trump, having a Jewish son-in-law and daughter, maintained the tradition of the Hanukkah party as well. So America really has changed a lot since John Adams and Calvin Coolidge. And even with a little bump along the way of a girl's ponytail catching on fire, Hanukkah seems to be firmly embedded in White House tradition at this point in time, after a couple of decades. So that was my Hanukkah commercial. I don't know if there are any questions about Hanukkah in the White House. So let's get on to TR, and hopefully finish up with get through a little bit of Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson. So TR is a fascinating guy. He's born sickly. He has asthma. He spends most of his days inside, but his father encourages him to build himself up. He does calisthenics. He boxes. He grows to be, a quite vigorous outdoorsman. He hunts. He becomes a cowboy and rancher. He is the New York City Commissioner of Police. He's a state representative. He's appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, eventually New York governor, and then he finds his way onto the McKinley ticket as vice president. One of the reasons that they put Roosevelt in the vice president's seat is that he could be a pain in the butt. And they felt that as a vice president, what harm could he do? He could make his pronouncements. He could, you're only a heartbeat away from the presidency. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. A little bit of interesting, a tidbit, one of these interesting pieces of trivia. Roosevelt, who was a lifelong hunter, also a conservationist as well, but he was on a bear hunting trip in 1902 in Mississippi, had no luck. And so his assistant had, he thought he was doing a nice thing. So they found a sickly bear and tied him to a tree and said to, hey, why don't you shoot the bear? And then you could pose with the carcass as a trophy. Now, he viewed this, Roosevelt, as extremely unsportsmanlike. So he refused to shoot the bear. They set it free. And the news of the event spread quickly through the newspapers. There's a famous cartoon by Clifford Berryman of Roosevelt and this, little bear. It was an old sickly bear, but In the cartoon, he's you know, like a cub. And a Jewish candy shop owner, candy store owner from Brooklyn, a guy named Morris Mitchum, sees the cartoon. He has this brilliant idea. His wife Rose makes stuffed animals that they sell in their candy store, and he writes to you can see where this is going. He writes to Roosevelt about creating a stuffed toy bear and dedicating it to the president, right, who refused to shoot the bear. And he calls it a teddy bear. And Roosevelt loves the idea. He mass produces the toy bears, that he starts the Ideal Toy Company. And to this day, the teddy bear has popularity around the world. And it can all be traced back to a Jewish couple who owned a Brooklyn candy store. Think about that next time you get a teddy bear for your grandchildren. Roosevelt grew up in Manhattan, and you know, certainly knew Jews from just his, not the neighborhood, but from being in the city, especially as he's reaching adulthood at a time when the Jewish population of New York really begins to rise precipitously. He becomes the police commissioner in the mid 1890s, and he appoints a lot of, at one time there had been Irish and then German, but he also felt that as New York City became more ethnically diverse, it was important to have a diverse police force. And so, you know, very interesting idea, way before it, ahead of its time, right? That your police force should mirror what your population looks like. Interesting concept. So he recruits Jewish police officers. And one great story is this anti-Semitic German preacher, a well-known anti-Semite, a guy named Alvart, visits from Berlin. He comes to preach against Jews, a rabid anti-Semite. And of course, many people are protesting his appearance. They want Roosevelt to silence him. He says, I can't, you know, we freedom of speech. In fact, what Roosevelt does is to make sure this guy Alvart is absolutely kept safe, so he is able to preach whatever he so chooses. What Roosevelt does is provide him with a police detail, making sure the sergeant in charge is Jewish, and there was somewhere between 30 and 40 police officers part of this detail. Roosevelt made sure every single one of them was Jewish. So this guy Alvart is surrounded, protected, as he gives these anti-Semitic talks by 30 or 40 of New York's finest, all of them Jewish. I love that story. Roosevelt also was asked by Rabbi Henry Pereira Mendez, who we knew from New York. He was the rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue, Sheriff Israel, who asked Roosevelt as commander-in-chief to intervene with the military because Jews were not getting, you know, yontifs off. And if a Jew is able to get a Shabbat, you know, leave to attend a religious service on a Shabbat or Yom Tov, it was at the whim of a commander. And Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, you know, issued a directive that, you know, when possible, this should be a norm that Jewish military personnel, they request time off for religious holidays, religious observances, should in fact be permitted, you know, for that. Oscar Strauss, our friend who was ambassador to Turkey, Roosevelt appoints him to his cabinet. He becomes the first Jewish member of the cabinet. He is appointed as Secretary of Commerce and Labor. In those days, the two departments were conjoined. So in 1906 is the first Jewish member of a presidential cabinet. In 1903, of course, the terrible Kishinev pogroms take place. Kishinev is the capital of Moldova today, right, which is an independent former Soviet republic. But Kishinev in Moldova had a terrible pogrom in 1903. 50 Jews were killed, hundreds were seriously wounded, and there were 1,500 businesses that were looted and plundered, I mean, destroyed. Perhaps most shocking was that, not that, you know, pogroms were so rare, quite the contrary, but this was not a spontaneous demonstration of anti-Semitism. It was supported by local government officials, including the police chief of the city, the support of Russia's rabidly anti-Semitic Minister of the Interior, Pleve Vyacheslav, and tens of thousands of Jews left Russia in those first few years of the 20th century because of this persecution. Roosevelt protests Kishinev, you know, in pretty strong language, but this is not an era where sanctions are employed against other countries. The typical response is, you know, countries have the right to conduct their own affairs internally. Roosevelt is also afraid of muddying relations with Russia. 3 years later, he actually, because he had something of a relationship with Tsarist Russia, that he's able to broker a peace between Russia and Japan. Russia is on the losing end of the Russo-Japanese War. In 1905, there's the Treaty of Portsmouth. Roosevelt is hailed as a great peacemaker, and he wins the Nobel Prize for Peace. Kind of interesting because he is one of the great aggressively jingoistic imperialist presidents, but he really did broker the agreement ending the war between Russia and Japan, and so, you know, he did earn a Nobel Peace Prize for that. It is during Roosevelt's administration that a new Jewish group comes into being called the American Jewish Committee. It has all of these leaders of American Jewry: Oscar Strauss, Louis Marshall, Cyrus Adler, Jacob Schiff, Judge Meyer Sulzberger, who is you know, one of the early supporters of conservative Judaism and the Jewish Theological Seminary. And the American Jewish Committee comes into being against the background of all of this persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe as a pressure group to you know, to lobby U.S. officials to demand that Russia's leadership, Romania's leadership, other Eastern European countries, that they halt their widespread anti-Semitic campaign. So at the end of the day, you know, Teddy Roosevelt is remembered, you know, well by the Jews of his generation. Many years later, Harry Golden, right, who's the editor of the Carolina Israelite, right, he's the guy who wrote the book 2 Cents Plain. He would write, and he was just a baby when Roosevelt was president, but he would write, quote, "Two of the most beloved Christians in the history of the American Jewish community were Enrico Caruso and Theodore Roosevelt. I doubt whether anyone else before or since has ever enjoyed the same degree of reverence and devotion." I don't know about that, but obviously Harry Golden was reflecting someone's sentiment to have written that. And clearly Roosevelt was quite popular in the Jewish community. So his handpicked successor, he decides not to run for another term. He could have, right? His first term really isn't considered a term because he succeeds after McKinley's assassination. And besides which, the Constitution didn't limit presidents to 2 terms. It was sort of like this informal, unwritten rule that presidents only serve two terms at most. So he decides not to run, and instead he really handpicks his successor, his buddy, William Howard Taft. Taft really didn't want to be president. It took a lot of persuading. Taft loved the law. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. So the presidency was sort of the, I guess, the silver medal for him. But Taft is the first sitting president to attend a Seder. He's also the first to speak at a Shabbos service. In May of 1909, he addresses worshipers at Reform Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Congregation Road of Shalom. He's from a Unitarian background. So that already makes him, pretty liberal among Christians. He grows up in Cincinnati, where he goes to a church right across the street from B'nai Yeshurun, which is Isaac Meyer Weiss's pulpit, one of the founders of Reform Judaism in the United States. In fact, his father, Taft's dad, was a good friend of Weiss, and sometimes they would go over just to hear his sermons. In fact, they also had dinner at each other's homes. Taft is the first president. He promotes a Jew to the rank of Rear Admiral. That rank didn't exist in much of the 19th century. Captain was about as high as you could go, and you were a Commodore if you were given a squad of ships. But Adolf Marix, who is an Annapolis graduate and a veteran of the Spanish-American War, fought in the Philippines, is promoted to Rear Admiral. He's friends with Oscar Strauss, Meyer Sulzberger, and a new fellow who comes into the world of politics and business at this time, a guy named Julius Rosenwald. So Judge Mayer Sulzberger, not only is a supporter of JTS, he's one of the founders of the Jewish Publication Society. In Taft's correspondence over 30 years, Sulzberger was a very prominent Republican supporter and correspondent with Taft. Rosenwald, of course, is the head of, one of the owners of Sears, Roebuck and Company. Another loyal supporter of Taft. Rosenwald goes on to be a founder of one of the founders of the NAACP, and a strong supporter of African-American education. He, with Booker T. Washington, is the founder of the Rosenwald schools. There are hundreds of these across the South. He was very concerned with promoting education. He believed in education from his own experience with Jews, and he promoted the same for in the African-American community. Now, an interesting incident that takes place during Taft's tenure, Russia refuses to honor the passports of American Jews traveling in Russia. So Taft speaks out against this. In fact, he makes it a campaign issue. Now, his friends from the American Jewish Committee, who also happen to be prominent Republicans, advise him to make this a campaign issue. It's interesting the way that Republican Party politics and the AJC, which should have been, ostensibly was a nonpartisan organization, how those two things seem to dovetail. today the HAC, would be, I think, much more careful in being scrupulously nonpartisan. But Taft takes the hint, and he speaks out strongly against Russia not honoring passports of Americans, right? American citizens who happen to be Jewish. He speaks out even forcefully at his inauguration. And in 1911, both houses of Congress, with Taft's support, notify the Tsarist government of its decision to abrogate the Russo-American Commercial Treaty, which went back to the 1830s. It also said that your citizens of each country could freely travel without hindrance to pursue business in the respective countries. So Taft was very proud of this. He would say it's the first time in American history that an international treaty would be rescinded as a reaction to religious persecution abroad. And indeed it was. Taft also took Henry Ford to task. Henry Ford was himself no friend of the Jewish people. In 1920, he published a series in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, called, quote unquote, The International Jew. It was just really a repackaged rehashing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a horribly anti-Semitic czarist forgery, which obviously Ford bought into. He excoriated both the protocols and Ford's newspaper quite forcibly. He already was out of office at this point. But there's one little interesting side note. Remember what I said earlier? Taft really wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. And in Woodrow Wilson's first administration, a vacancy comes open. But it's a Democrat. It's Wilson. By the way, Wilson only wins because in 1912, Roosevelt, who has missed being president, and he's traveled the world, but he's gotten bored. He wants to be president again. He ends his friendship with Taft. It's a very bitter contest for the nomination in the Republican Party. He loses, not by much, but he loses to Taft. It's very dirty, very bitter. So he goes off and he starts his own political party, the Progressive Party. And he's popular enough that he splits the votes. So if it had been Roosevelt or Taft, probably it would have been a Republican who won. But because Roosevelt runs as a third party candidate, he's the spoiler. Taft loses, Roosevelt loses, Wilson wins. Wilson nominates a fellow named Louis Brandeis as a Supreme Court justice. And Taft is very unhappy. In fact, he writes a pretty nasty letter. He doesn't like Brandeis. He calls it an evil and a disgrace. He writes how the intelligent Jews of the country are obviously opposed to this. But that, the other Jewish leaders, with their quote unquote clannishness, are embarrassing leading and liberal and clear-sighted Jews. If you agreed with him, then you were clear-sighted, I guess. Taft called Brandeis a practitioner of extreme Judaism and said that, and Brandeis was not an observant Jew at all, but he was a Zionist. And so Taft writes, Brandeis has adopted Zionism, favors the New Jerusalem, and has metaphorically been re-circumcised. He has gone all over the country making speeches, arousing the Jewish spirit, even wearing a hat in the synagogue while making a speech in order to attract those bearded rabbis. If it were necessary, I am sure he would have grown a beard to convince him that he was a Jew of the Jews. So, not the nicest letter. Taft certainly opposed Brandeis's Zionist leanings. He certainly was disappointed that he felt he should have been the nominee for a Supreme Court position. There obviously is a certain tinge of, is it anti-Semitism? I don't know. I would call it, it's not nice. It's not nice. It also goes to show how, we like black and white distinctions. Taft does a lot for the Jewish community. And yet, right, so the notion that one is all of one thing or another. Nixon, when we'll get to Nixon, we'll see that in many ways, he was a better friend to Israel than Henry Kissinger. And yet, Nixon was filled with off the record, which wasn't off the record because he was busy recording it, said all sorts of horrible anti-Semitic things. So I think we have to be careful when we say somebody is a friend of the Jews or somebody is an adversary of the Jews. It doesn't necessarily work so clearly, so simply, so neatly that everything can be, parsed on some surgical line. I know that pundits and spinners want to say good guy, bad guy, but it just isn't all that easy. So our last president for tonight is Woodrow Wilson. By the way, happy ending to the Taft story. He does get to become a Supreme Court justice. He is appointed by Warren Harding as Chief Justice. And there he serves for 9 years until shortly before his death in 1930. All right, so Wilson, a Southerner, Presbyterian minister as a father. A lot of Presbyterian ministers whose sons become presidents. Wilson was actually pretty frum, though, if you will. He prays morning and evening. He says grace before each meal. He attends Wednesday and Sunday services. He reads the Bible every day. In the Jewish context, we would say that's not a frum guy, but he's a pretty committed guy. He's a graduate of Princeton. He earns his law degree from the University of Virginia, but decides instead of, he hangs a shingle briefly, but then he goes on and he earns a PhD in political science and international affairs from Johns Hopkins. He ends up teaching on the faculty of Princeton and then becomes president. In 1910, he becomes the governor of New Jersey. And then 2 years later, as Roosevelt and Taft go head to head, he slips in and becomes president. Probably the Jewish figure that impacts him the most is Brandeis. Brandeis wrote a book when he's a Harvard Law grad. He went into private practice, but he also wrote and lectured. And he writes a book called Other People's Money, which comes to influence Wilson's thinking about the need to get rid of tariffs and protectionism. It actually fits in very well with Wilson's own political leanings, which Wilson's doctrine is called the New Freedom, which was kind of using the power of government for the purpose of social justice, antitrust legislation, block grants to states for highway construction, tariff reduction, banking regulations, things that the Democratic Party came to embrace. In some ways, was a forerunner of FDR. But in any event, Wilson nominates Brandeis, and this occasions a huge storm. It is by far the most contentious confirmation fight for a Supreme Court position in history up to that point. I mean, we think now we have fights. The judiciary, the Senate Judiciary Committee, had never had to hold hearings before. It was, kind of a rubber stamp. The Senate Judiciary Committee would simply make sure the candidate was qualified and then pass it on to the full Senate for a vote. And that was it. Supreme Court Justice. This is the first time the Senate Judiciary Committee has to hold hearings, and the hearings go on for 4 months. 6 presidents of the American Bar Association, the 6 living presidents at the time, all wrote letters opposing Brandeis. He's confirmed, but it's not a slam dunk. It's 47-22. Now, Brandeis turns out to be a great Supreme Court justice who serves for 23 years. Even Taft, in the end, apologizes. Wilson, to his credit, despite getting all of this political flack, he sticks to his guns. He stands by Brandeis, who ultimately is confirmed. Right? So, moral compass, stands up for his beliefs, doesn't buckle under pressure. Yet at the same time, Wilson is an ardent segregationist and a horrible racist who institutes segregation in almost all areas of the federal civil service, including areas of the federal bureaucracy where there had been none. Right. So again, got to be careful not to say that somebody is all white or all black, all good or all bad. Brandeis, along with Rabbi Stephen Wise. Stephen Wise is he had been at Temple Emmanuel in New York, that big Reform flagship. He left because he required in his contract that they guarantee him freedom of the pulpit, that he could preach on whatever he wanted. And all of the magnates of Emmanuel and the cream of New York City Jewry said, "What? Freedom of the pulpit?" So he left and started his own synagogue, which the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue still exists today. It's, but he also started a rabbinical school, the Jewish Institute of Religion, which later merged with Hebrew Union College. Unlike the vast majority of Reform rabbis at the turn of the 20th century, he was an ardent Zionist. Despite being so liberal, he's also one of the founders of the ZOA, Zionist Organization of America. I'm not sure that he'd be so happy with them today, because he is quite liberal in a variety of other ways. But history takes some interesting turns along the way. So Wise and Brandeis both influence Wilson to support the Balfour Declaration. The State Department is very much opposed to it. Robert Lansing, who is the Secretary of State, is very much opposed to it. Wilson's aide and his right-hand man, Edward Howes, who everybody called Colonel Howes, though he never served in the military. He was no colonel, but okay. Colonel Sanders, so I guess there could be Colonel Howes. And nevertheless, Brandeis and even though Wilson wavered at times between Brandeis and Wise, they were able to convince him to support it. I think his own biblical roots, his own Presbyterian roots, were also, he confessed later to Wise that he was very proud. His father would be very proud that he had supported a diplomatic document that called for a return of Jews to their ancestral homeland. One interesting thing is that the original language of the Balfour Declaration said that Britain would establish a national haven for Jews. not a national homeland. Now you can argue what the heck is a national homeland. That's, that's been a whole debate, but it certainly sounds a lot more like a country than a national haven. When the text of the Balfour Declaration was sent to Wilson, he asked Wise to look at it. And Wise suggested the change from national haven to national homeland. Wilson agreed, passed the document back to Lord Balfour, and indeed that change, that amendment was accepted. So you can thank either Rabbi Stephen Wise or, if you like, Wilson for, valuing Wise's opinion enough to have, that change made in the document. A few other people, very briefly, that Wilson had a relationship with: Bernard Baruch, really Baruch, but Baruch is, when you're assimilated, is what you say. Who can say the ch anyway? He's a self-made millionaire who is born his father was a Confederate Army surgeon. He was born in Camden, South Carolina. They move up to New York. He becomes an office boy in a Wall Street firm, makes $3 a week, but watches very carefully. And by the time he's 30, he is a multimillionaire. Wilson appoints Baruch to his Council of National Defense, right? About a year before the United States has become, is in the war. And Baruch will become the chairman of the War Industries Board in 1917. A hugely important position, right? America has just gone to war. And for the first time, you have a national effort, right? Where you have a board that is determining everything from rationing to what factories should be making to support the war effort. And that's Bernard Baruch, who heads that. He also goes with Wilson to Paris to advise the president on Versailles, on the economic aspects of Versailles. Later on, Baruch helps the Wilsons after they leave office. Woodrow Wilson's the last two and a half years in office were really tragic. He has a stroke. He's a very, very stubborn and inflexible man. He is not good at politicking, and the art of compromise is not his forte. The United States does not agree to the Treaty of Versailles. They do not join the League of Nations, right? These were his babies, and his own country, of which he is president, rejected both of these things. But Baruch helps the Wilsons buy a house in Washington. And in fact, he even goes so far as to buy the property next door, the lot adjacent to the house, so that they would have more privacy. Henry Morgenthau Sr., chair of the Democratic National Committee's DNC's Finance Committee. He gets appointed by Wilson in 1913 as ambassador. Guess where? Turkey. Where else? Morgenthau also was very, very instrumental in supporting Wilson's campaign for the U.S. joining the League of Nations, but again, no cigar. And finally, last but not least, Paul Warburg. Warburg is one of the architects of the Federal Reserve Board, created in 1913. He becomes a vice chair. This is one of the signature pieces of legislation still in place. The U.S. really had no national bank, and we had panics roughly every 15 years. We would have some huge economic upheaval with not a really good way of trying to regulate that or prevent it, runs on banks. And so Warburg and a number of other politicians and business leaders get together very, very secretly on Jekyll Island. They have a secret meeting in 1910. The irony, the Jekyll Island Club I think was exclusive enough that Jews weren't normally allowed there, but J.P. Morgan arranged for this, so I guess they made an exception. And they hammered out the details for the Federal Reserve Board. And it is Wilson who appoints Warburg as vice chair in 1916. So that is Woodrow Wilson. Clearly somebody who is perceived to have been a friend of the Jewish people. He had some other, dark areas, such as his record on race. But he did support in the end the Balfour Declaration and felt very good about it. Many of his, what he felt were his most important achievements, though, never found expression in, never found acceptance in America. And I think that also broke his heart, that the US didn't become a part of the League of Nations. You can only wonder, might, we have been in a better place if the United States had played more of a role in international politics instead of retreating into isolationism in the 1920s. But that's a question that we just will never be able to answer. I'm going to stop here. I'm going for quite a while. Let me, questions, comments? Dr. Cantor? Sure, go ahead.
The fact that there was so much resistance in Congress to the confirmation of Brandeis, was that because of his policies, Brandeis, or was it Semitic, anti-Semitic?
Probably a combination. I mean, he was identified with, this is also a time of labor upheaval, strikes, unions. Brandeis represented a lot of poor people. In fact, one of his, he was called the People's Attorney. Took a lot of pro bono cases. So he was called radical, pro-union, quote unquote liberal, whichever, that means whatever you want it to mean. I think for some, his support of Zionism, which he came to late. And he was born in 1856. His first pro-Zionist statement isn't recorded till 1911. Some who just hated Wilson. Republicans hated Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt hated Wilson. And some of it was anti-Semitism, no doubt about it. I mean, he was eminently qualified. He was just, so there were, it was a very divided vote, a decisive one, but a divided vote. And the fact that you had confirmation hearings for 4 months, that had never happened in American history. Now, they're just showcases for, it's sad that, we don't, even Antonin Scalia, arch conservative, was, I think he was confirmed 98 to 0. Because it was on the basis not of his, was he qualified? So, now it's a whole partisan political thing. But that arguably starts back with Brandeis. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Rabbi, when Joseph was in the military, he always took off for all of the holidays. And as long as he had a non-Jewish boss, there was never a problem, and they never counted it as part of his leave. But he had a Jewish boss in Bethesda, and he made Joe take his leave time in order to celebrate Jewish holidays.
Those Jewish bosses, they are the worst for Jews.
This guy really was the worst.
It's true. I mean, look, the synagogue.
I know he was the worst.
I have to work on holidays.
when I
Well, look
was,
at me. Look, and I got a bunch of Jews who are my bosses, and I work on holidays. And
Well,
I
you have
always-
the best boss that I ever had was an Australian, not Jewish, didn't know any Jews, but he was so respectful. And but anyway, I mean, all joking aside, Teddy Roosevelt tried.
yeah, when I was
What
on
can I tell
active
you?
duty, I always volunteered to work Christmas Day.
so did Joe.
Well, Roosevelt, by the way, so you know, he had a lot of respect for anybody who was religious, didn't matter what, whose religion also was not about saving his soul only, but about, you know, making the world a better place. It was kind of a tikkun olam view of religion. And his belief was that Judaism was that kind of religion, at least, you know, from the Jews that he knew and met. He wasn't, you know, he did not know from ultra Orthodox folk who were just focused on, you know, internal details of observance. Jews he knew were tikkun olam kinds of Jews who wanted to improve the world. And he had a tremendous amount of respect for that.
Hey, Rabbi, I just wanted to relate a story about how this time around the turn of the previous century touched my life. The first house I ever owned was in Haverhill, Massachusetts. It was built in 1899. And as I was renovating the basement, I was not being as careful as I probably should have been had I known what I was going to find, but I was ripping out things from the overhead in the basement. And down came the Boston Globe, January 1st, 1900.
Oh my gosh, okay.
And on the headline on the paper that day was Queen Liliuokalani petitions the president for return of her homeland. She was the last regent of Hawaii. And I just, you know, felt like I was holding history in my hand there. Somebody had obviously left it as a time capsule for somebody to find in the future. And just found it kind of moving to find that.
Did you save it?
I'd have to ask Harrison's mom. One of those separations of property things.
Because that you know, that's quite that's quite something that and you know, having a wife now who is that, I think it was a message being sent to you but from the future. But that's, yeah, the truth is though, that's a very sad, not one of our, and the war that we fought in the Philippines, right? The Spanish-American War was, you know, a splendid little war. The war in the Philippines, as we, you know, we went to war to safeguard Cuban independence, but we did not have the same respect for what were called condescendingly our little brown brothers in the Philippines, and it was a really hard fought and dirty war. The 2.5 years that the United States was fighting against Filipino and quote unquote insurgents. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. They welcomed America at first, till they found out that the United States was not going anywhere. They weren't just saying, "Here, we kicked out the Spanish for you. Happy to see you independent." And really, in some ways, you know, a kind of miniature Vietnam at a time when nobody was looking. You know, that kind of war didn't occasion that sort of focus and attention, but really a sad chapter in our history, and one that both McKinley and, you know, TR presided over. Teddy Roosevelt liked his imperialism.
And Taft was involved too. I think Taft was governor in the Philippines, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He was actually a pretty good governor. He was more sympathetic. But again, I mean, you could argue the whole thing was rotten. Although in the end, I mean, it took us 46 years, but you know, eventually we did get out and let the Filipinos have their own country. Better late than ever. But really not a tale that is one of our prouder chapters.
Rabbi, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned Uganda as being one of those possible places where the Jews could settle. It was also discussed that Jews could go to a part of outback Australia, a part known as the Kimberley in Western Australia. And at the time, I think it was floated, the comment was that, oh, there's nothing there. Why would the Jews want to go there? Well, of course, if anybody knows anything about that area, as I do, they've found extraordinary diamond mines, the pink Argyle diamonds, and the area up there now is beautifully cultivated with fruits and other things. So it would have been a possibility, but back in those days, they thought there was nothing there.
Right. Well, then it goes to, I mean, do we have a claim? There's only one place that we really have a claim to. But sometimes, you know, it's hit or miss. Moses, if he had made a right turn, we could have had all of the oil of Iran and Iraq. I mean, now Israel has found natural gas in the Mediterranean. So, you know, I mean, Uganda, I think it was a good choice. I agree with Reverend Blackstone. Uganda was not the place for us as Jews. And there is no biography of this guy. And I am really, I'm really itching to find out more about him because, you know, just his timing, his charisma and getting all of these, you know, famous people to sign on. I mean, granted, it was, it didn't go anywhere, but it's a fascinating story. And he actually influences Herzl. Herzl hears of Blackstone and reads Blackstone and in part is influence that maybe if this guy could have entree with all of these rich and powerful American businessmen, maybe so who am I? I'm just a journalist, you know, from Vienna. Maybe I could be, you know, reaching out to meet with world leaders and plead the cause of Jewish nationalism in its ancestral homeland. So indirectly, Blackstone accomplished a lot more than he perhaps realized, but didn't live to see the establishment of the state of Israel, but lived long enough to see Zionism become, you know, a vibrant undertaking. Well, that brings us to the end of our time.
Many thanks, Rabbi.
Sure. Next time we'll go full swing into most of the time we're going to spend on, you know, one of the more complicated figures, and that's FDR, who was beloved by Jews at the time, but they also didn't know a lot of what FDR did or didn't do behind the political scene. So we'll re-examine FDR and see, you know, how do we make sense of this president who was so beloved by so many, including Jews, and yet could have done so much more to save Jews from the Holocaust. I wish everybody happy Hanukkah and see you all soon.
Toda
Thank you,
Rabba.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Sure, bavakasha. Take care. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.